Welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Susan Kaplan, Director of Global Open Enrollment Programs at Tepper's Executive Education at Carnegie Mellon University. We're thrilled to welcome you to this webinar, Cybersecurity Accountability, What the Board Doesn't Know Could Destroy the Business, which we're thinking of as a kind of sneak peek of the upcoming executive education program, Cybersecurity Accountability in the Corporate Board. We like to think of executive education as where academia meets industry, as our exec ed programs are designed to have actionable key takeaways for participants working in industry. And this program is no exception. It's exactly that. We're thrilled to have Greg Porter, an adjunct professor at Carnegie Mellon's Heinz College and an industry leader at the helm of this program. In addition to teaching at CMU, Greg is also the founder of Allegheny Digital, an information security consultancy specializing in enterprise risk management, incident response, technical cybersecurity assessments, and training. For the past 20 plus years, Greg has both led and delivered comprehensive assessment activities that audit, test, and monitor the effectiveness of information security controls and enterprise defenses. He has assisted hundreds of organizations ranging from technology and healthcare startups to global manufacturing, biotechnology, and financial services organizations, among others. Beyond technical assessments, Greg has also evaluated cybersecurity awareness and competency within the boardroom and has used his experience to develop novel training programs such as this one to improve cyber literacy. He serves as an instructor for the SANS Institute, as well as Carnegie Mellon University's Chief Information Security Officer Executive Program. Without further ado, I'm pleased to turn it over to Greg Porter.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Susan. Welcome, everyone. Delighted to be with you here today to talk about cybersecurity accountability in the corporate board. Specifically, hopefully just observationally give you some feedback that I have in terms of what the board doesn't know and how that may negatively impact potentially the business. And certainly we want to avoid that. But yes, a nice sunny day here in Pittsburgh. At least it started that way. I think we get about 50 of these a year, so we were rejoicing until the rain started. So let's go ahead and get things kicked off here. So Susan, I'll avoid the speaker introduction. She did a great job in that regard. But at the end of the day, I've been working in the field of information security for the past 20 plus years. My goodness, I can't believe how quickly time flies. And really one of the things that I've seen, particularly over certainly the last decade easily, especially when we're involved in incident management and incident response, oftentimes we're there because of not just a failure in cybersecurity controls, but also that really necessary understanding, which is lacking at the board level. So to kind of think about the problem, we're emerging out of threat reporting season, if you will. Historically, this is usually the first 4 to 6 months of every year. And there are certain companies I look forward to seeing what their documentation brings forward, maybe some new light that it can shed on the industry about the past year and the events that had happened and what they observed. But routinely, if you look at these reports, whether they're put out by PwC, KPMG, FireEye, et cetera, all good data points in there. But when it comes to boards, it's often acknowledged that the boards are recognizing the importance of cybersecurity. And when I see those types of data points, I kind of chuckle because, if you were a board member and you were asked, do you think cybersecurity is important? I think you're probably going to say yes. I don't think anybody's going to, no, it's not important. What's the next question? So even though it seems like boards appear to be getting the message that cybersecurity is important, I'm seeing a disconnect for how they're challenging cybersecurity operations in leadership to hold the CISO, for example, to account. And I don't mean that in a negative fashion. I mean, just to say, hey, are we doing the good thing, for example, when it comes to cyber hygiene? And what intelligent question can I ask this cybersecurity leader? And conversely, what can the CISO ask the board, and what information do they want to make sure that the security posture of the organization is being improved upon and maintained over time? So we have some work to do in that area. Oftentimes to directors, to board members, it's unclear how to defensively align a cybersecurity program with business impact. So for example, how do we make money, and how does cybersecurity preserve that type of objective in operation? Somewhat ironically, but I guess not surprisingly, it is we've created as an industry in information security consensus-based practices for improving cybersecurity governance, physical safeguards, technical safeguards. We're getting better at measuring program maturity, but when it comes to cyber maturity at the board level, that to me is kind of very immature and ripe with opportunity for improvement. And as we often say, when we're working in an incident, or just generally, 100% of boards wish they had better cybersecurity oversight 100% of the time following a breach. If we just made that judicious decision, if we knew how to better manage our risk and maybe understood it better, we could have maybe prevented or minimized the disruptive event that occurred. So you combine this kind of challenge when it comes to cyber literacy at that director level with what's going on and has been going on for the past 20 plus years easily. And that is that kind of each year that always seems to get louder about cyber incidents and how businesses are disrupted. So if we look at some of the data points, we won't spend too much time here, but our friends at Risk-Based Security, just looking at 2021, since we're kind of emerging out of Q1. If we look back at 2021, more than 22 billion sensitive or confidential records were exposed. So the good news is that's less than what we observed as an industry for 2020. The bad news is it's the second highest year for volume of confidential data compromised since 2005. So to put that into context, when we say records, we mean things like intellectual property, personally identifiable information, sensitive data sets, medical records, and so forth. And part of the challenge, if you're listening and you're a cyber defender, you certainly understand this, but it's the expanding attack surface. So is our board aware of, as we emerge, thankfully, out of this COVID-based pandemic, among other challenges that we have as a business, understanding if we're writing software, for example, and some of the libraries that we're using are free and open source software, have we done our diligence to make sure that we're embedding secure coding practices into the software that we write? Oftentimes that does not happen, unfortunately. And so we have vulnerable systems and applications, of course. You think about the internet connectivity that we have. Some of you listening are probably at your home office, working from home. And even on your home network, you might have 30, 40, 50 devices easily. You're like, well, Greg, it's not that many. Maybe it's 20. Nevertheless, it's kind of connected Internet of Things, the IoT, cameras, baby monitors, refrigerators. I mean, every appliance, it always kind of makes me laugh. Literally the toasters, the coffee makers, simply because we can connect it to the internet doesn't necessarily mean that we should, but this is happening at an industry level. So just kind of anecdotally, a few years ago, we were working with one of our manufacturing clients who had a remote location for one of their manufacturing facilities, and they had an on-site engineer that wanted better visibility of one of their production yards. And so this individual, no malicious intent here, right? They went out to Best Buy, picked up an IP-based camera, connected it to the production network, and the next thing you know, this thing is communicating with IP addresses in China. Wasn't intended, but that quickly, you can kind of expand the potential threat surface to the business. So cyber physical systems, as I kind of mentioned, technologies that historically weren't necessarily intended to be connected to the internet now are. Data sprawl as well with cloud services. And so you take all these challenges that we have, then you put it in the blender and mix it with a remote workforce. And we might not even have access, some of the businesses, to virtual desktop infrastructure. Even if they do, how are we controlling that endpoint device? So this is really kind of challenged the envelope of traditional asset control and configuration management that many of us were accustomed to prior. So those lines are certainly blurring. And because they're blurring, this is creating visibility gaps in terms of detective and preventative control. So things like endpoint threat detection and response. Is that deployed on all the assets connecting to the production environment? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. What about log management? How is our security operations center getting situational awareness about what's going on in the environment? The time not to learn about those lack of controls is during when you have an incident, because it's a cascading effect. When we lose visibility, Then we also have to recover assets, that's where perhaps our continuity of operations and our disaster recovery plans start to get stressed. So if you're listening, thinking about, I'm sure you've heard this before. When was the last time we tested it? Yes, great, we get it. We have backups. Well, when was the last time you actually did a full recovery of your backup data sets to make sure that those applications and systems that need that data can be restored and be operational, in line with your recovery time and recovery point objectives? So this all comes down to oversight, right? Not just from the security operations team and CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, but also the board levels. The board do they have visibility into where there may be some deficient practices within the organization, or are things operating as intended? Will we be able to answer those types of questions? So highly profitable attacks have become a breach differentiator. These cyber criminal gangs, nation state actors, realize that if they can have an impact on an organization, get after sensitive data sets, encrypt that information, whether it's through ransom or other types of attacks, extract some type of monetary gain from that encounter. Well, hey, we paid the ransom, we're going to get our data decrypted, right? Well, that adversary or another one might read about that attack, and now you have a recurrence. So, you're inviting a lot of challenges by simply by not engaging in good cyber hygiene. So now more than ever, at least I would argue, that the pressure to provide appropriate cybersecurity oversight at that board level is higher than it's been, and it's only going to increase for the foreseeable future. So some of these misconnections at the board level, I talked about these surveys indicating cybersecurity is a top priority, but year over year, we see these really challenging and debilitating breaches impacting organizations across verticals, whether you're in the manufacturing industry, like Norsk Hydro is, in the aluminum industry, SolarWinds, writing configuration and asset management and network monitoring software, and they've been doing that for years. Literally, you could have a product get introduced through what you thought were reasonable supply chain activities into your business. And if that software gets compromised, how widespread would it be within your own organization? I talked about these cyber physical systems. Well, we have anecdotal evidence of that as well with the Colonial Pipeline attack, where, regardless of whether we're distributing gas through a pipeline or some other means, if we can't bill our constituency, we're just shutting down revenue generation in that instance. And so many, because of these, whether it's warranted or not, and this stuff gets sensationalized in many cases in the press and by the media. But the reality is many directors and many boards believe that the organization lacks the resources that would help them defend against a cyber attack. And so I think we need to achieve some fair-mindedness. When these events happen, right, what are they usually followed by? Well, it's usually, let's fire the CISO. Let's go after that person because it's their fault that we got breached, right? Or let's maybe hold the CEO to account. All understandable, certainly. I would contend, well, when is the board, one of those board members going to be held to account, right? Because they have oversight and should have oversight, not just with risk, but with respect to cybersecurity. So, how do we kind of create this level field of intelligence between the CISO and the board? Some of the challenges just institutionally that we have, if you look at S&P 500 boards, they have more directors over the age of 75 than they do under the age of 50. So, this isn't to insult anyone's intelligence here, but if I talk to, family members, my niece and nephew who are much younger than me, and the way they're using technology is very different from, as a Gen Xer, the way that I grew up using technology. So those kind of create nuances that I might not understand if I'm not engaging with them and asking those types of questions. And it's no different at the board level. Somebody who's 75, 80 years old might not be consuming and as versed on technology, understandably, as somebody who's younger. More so, the people that are staffing these roles oftentimes are from a younger demographic. So your chief information security officers, chief privacy officers, CIOs, and so forth, making sure that they're relating what the business risk is in clear terms and not get overly technical about some of these challenges. Because we're looking to improve in this areas, many companies and many CISOs, friends of mine, are really paying the price. I talk generically about CISOs getting fired. I mean, it's not generic, that's a reality for, unfortunately, a lot of professionals. If you look at the average tenure of a chief information security officer, slightly less or slightly more than 24 months. Most of them consider themselves to be under high stress. And why is this? So I've been in board meetings, I've presented to boards, I've sat while other CISOs have presented to boards, and it can be stressful, and it doesn't have to be. I talked with the CISOs, and in fact, just a few weeks ago, I was talking with one. He said, we have a board meeting coming up. Fortunately for me, my board is very kind of technically oriented, but they're challenging me on certain things, and I want to make sure we start to kind of go in and level set some expectations about how we're improving as an organization and helping the business move forward. Well, that worked to that person's benefit, but sometimes you have board members who maybe don't have that high degree of technical acumen, and you take perhaps a very technical CISO, and they're going in and talking about vulnerabilities and web application firewall rules and DevSec operations and so forth, and it just goes over people's heads, and that's a missed opportunity. So how can we start to create some kind of consensus standardization about how to communicate with the board, how the board should be holding the executive team and leadership team to account, and how we can measure that ideally over time. But it's much more than just the CISO. This is resulting in kind of this downstream effect of organizations having to incur higher costs because of poor cyber hygiene. Again, things that when I say this, I'm thinking, how could the board get engaged here to avoid these types of challenges, or at least minimize the impact? So because of these ongoing cyber attacks, this is leading to an increase in the demand for cyber liability insurance. Okay, Greg, well, that sounds reasonable. And it does. And I remember when this phenomenon started about 15 years ago, basically the Q&A session, whether it was, AIG or Chubb or one of those organizations, here comes the incoming questionnaire to the cybersecurity leader for that business, and typically it was in a spreadsheet, and essentially it was asking, hey, tell us a little bit about your cybersecurity operations. And you would fill out this questionnaire and email it back, often with lack of encryption or anything like that. Just here you go, here's our security program in a spreadsheet. And there was a high likelihood that you were going to get a cyber liability insurance policy at that time. I mean, these things were being extended by those organizations regularly. Well, those days are dead and gone because of some of these high ransom amounts that have been paid. And of course, the smart people running the insurance companies, they're all about risk management themselves. So they're trying to better calibrate and understand, should we extend a policy to this organization, or is there a more kind of inferred or understood degree, a likelihood that they're going to suffer a breach? And, to some extent, that's going to impact our business, of course, as well, in terms of paying premiums and clauses and so forth. So what they're now doing is standing up, in many cases, their own practices, the insurance companies are. So they're doing things like internet-facing vulnerability scans, looking for misconfigured systems, clear text services like file transfer protocol, telnet. And if they start to see these things, basic authentication, this is kind of evidence that maybe they don't have good configuration management. Maybe they don't understand that these services are even out there and why that might be a detriment to the business potentially. So maybe they start to do some additional investigations, start asking about vulnerability management policies and procedures. And they look at this data, right, at these documents. And if they're not seeing things like internal security level agreements around SLAs for how quickly, if we have a high or critical vulnerability, how quickly do we remediate that? Is that defined? Is it a matter of days, weeks? I can tell you firsthand, oftentimes when we go into an organization and we're looking at vulnerability program management, it's widely variable in terms of internal SLAs for how quickly a vulnerability is going to get remediated in terms of weeks, days, times, hours, and so on. So do they have sufficient policies and procedures, not just with respect to vulnerability management, but also things like backup and recovery processes? Again, because of these ransom-based events, do they have some sophistication around understanding why that might be a risk? So they kind of take these data points together and they create a rating of your organization. And if it's not them doing it, it's going to be a third party like BitSight or Trava Security or Security Scorecard. And if the score does not come in at a rating that they think is acceptable, then they're not going to engage with the organization. It's just the discussion is going to end at that point. So at the end of the day, poor cyber acumen at the board level can result in these higher premiums or a non-starter for insurance companies altogether. So if we kind of pivot and think about the corporate board responsibilities, we kind of have this, this non-player character. Who are these people? What does the board do? For some of us listening, maybe we're not a board member, but we want to be at some point. In a general sense, these are the individuals that are accountable for setting strategic planning and oversight of the organization, establishing mission, what's our corporate vision, our values, and more, you see what's kind of coming out into the media. We have our brand, right, which is how we view the company kind of internally through marketing and what we've built over the years, or maybe just a short period of time. And then we have reputation, right? So how does not only our shareholders and maybe our constituents see us, but the general public, right? These things matter, as they should, to organizations. So your board is responsible for having intelligent oversight of those types of aspects of your operation. They also, of course, select, compensate the CXO position, corporate officers. And the reason they're a board member to begin with is they're brought on ideally because of their expertise, the success that they've had in other areas, maybe auditing, accounting, financial services, maybe software development. So they bring these people in, they contribute what you know to help us guide our business in the right direction. So they monitor performance, help maintain competitive situational awareness. But here's kind of a disconnect that I often see. So the easy question is, okay, how does the company make money? And of course, your board members should understand that. If they don't, then maybe your problems are a little deeper. But they understand, yes, okay, how do we make money? We make widgets, right? But then where you start to get some decays, if you say, okay, that's how you make money. Well, tell me the technology assets that actually support your mission fulfillment. So what servers and workstations and endpoint devices does your intellectual property live on? Who has access to that? And very quickly, you get this decay. And that's what the adversary is exactly exploiting, is that lack of consistent and pragmatic risk oversight. So the board members, by extension, should have that level of insight, but often don't when it comes to cybersecurity. Knowledgeable of geopolitical issues, which sadly have really come into focus over the past few months, and were always an issue, but more so those stakes have been heightened considerably for a lot of organizations. So at the end of the day, they want to be accountable not just to the board, but also the shareholders, the employees, the workforce members, making investments in that organization to drive it forward. As a board member, what are these fiduciary responsibilities and our duties? So for directors, a fiduciary duty is just an obligation that we're acting in good faith, good care. We have reasonable oversight of that organization. So now I won't go through each of these, but if we think about duty of care, that when we're going to make a decision on behalf of that organization, with its degree of reasonableness, because these are often time-boxed decisions. We don't have maybe 4 years to make this decision, right? So we're going to do as much research as we can using our constituency and our workforce members to provide us with the needed intelligence, right? To make the best informed decision we can at that point in time, based on the information that's available to us. And I'll give you just another quick example. You're working for an organization, you're going to acquire one of your competitors through merger and acquisition. So it's reasonable that the board would say, well, hey, before we start connecting those cloud tenants and those devices to our production network, what does the security posture of this company that we're acquiring, what does it look like? Do we even know? I mean, right, all you have to do is ask the question. Are you getting any level of comfort about what the answers are? Because once those systems are connected, all bets are off. It's too late, because now their problems are your problems. But ideally, maybe part of the contingency of acquiring that company is that they start to mitigate and manage the risks that you've identified through your duty of care. Duty of loyalty, where board members working for the organization in the capacity of serving the company are doing so objectively and without personal economic conflict. Greg, that never happens, right? Well, I mean, all of us listening know those stories and those challenges where people get compromised and maybe they start selling stocks or shorting the company, to make a financial gain because of the insider knowledge that they have about the business. So at the end of the day, we don't want to act maliciously or with willful neglect that we should have known something and simply did not do our research. But that's really the goal of your fiduciary duties as a board members. We're providing this objective, informed oversight of the organization to make us a differentiator in the market versus our competitors. When that comes to cybersecurity, because this is still maturing, I remember reading some time ago, many years ago, about shareholders starting to ask questions around, well, this incident happened, but what was the board doing about it? I mean, were they kind of negligent on some level? So the expectation of shareholders now, more than ever, and for those of you that maybe have joined us that are working for a private equity firm, or maybe you're part of a startup, really embedding these practices from the outset can be just tremendously beneficial, right? Understanding how do we defend what makes us unique in terms of our data and systems. How this translates to the board members, that we need our board members to be cyber literate, right? To be kind of digitally literate around what it is that makes us unique when it comes to technology, and how do we defend that? Do we even know those questions that we should be asking? So if we understand how we make money, what are the assets that are doing that? And okay, we're checking that box, great, we get it. Well, then, how are we protecting things like confidentiality, integrity, and availability of those assets? What's the cybersecurity posture of this organization? I don't care if you say it's from a 1 to a 5 or an A to an F, whatever that rating system is that you're using. Are we doing something like that to kind of calibrate periodically where we stand? Maybe not just year over year for our own business, but what about peer-based organizations? We can get sanitized comparisons. Maybe our competitor is rated as a C+, and we're striving to be that A level, but currently we're on par with them. How would we know that if we're not challenging kind of senior leadership to kind of think in those terms? So this remains a challenge to kind of balance this risk with the business and provide oversight at the board level. So, and this is being amplified as well by different regulatory agencies. So if you thought, I've heard about this cyber accountability at the board level, but we're kind of going to play the wait and see approach, and a lot of companies for years have been doing just that. I think those times are rapidly changing, and just over the next couple of slides, I have an example. So in February of 2018, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, they issued some guidance around risk management and incident management for publicly traded companies. And by interpretive guidance, I mean, it's not a requirement. These are things that they were recommending, the SEC that is, that you do when you have a breach that's material to the organization. So something that's going to impact shareholder value or finances. So if you look through that, many of us at the time were hopeful that the SEC was going to be a bit more perhaps prescriptive. These are the practices that we're expecting to see, and now this is required. But they did give a little bit of foreshadowing in there. If you look through that 2018 document, they talk about risk oversight and disclosures regarding a company's risk management processes, and how does the board engage, with understanding what cybersecurity risks may be to that organization, and how does that get conveyed to investors, as an example. So, but again, because it was kind of interpretive guidance and not a requirement, I think a lot of organizations looked at that and they considered, okay, when we go into notification, what do we need to account for on our 10K and 8K forms and so forth. But then that dynamic started to change. In fact, about a year ago, the SEC came out and said, those rules that and kind of suggestions that we came out with in 2018, we're going to update that and modify that. Now, I thought at the time we might see something in 2021 around Q4 or so. But the good news is that it came out last month, basically. So this proposed rule that the SEC has put forward, so they kind of adapted what they said back in 2018 and 2011 prior to that. And they said, here's our proposal for publicly traded organizations. So current reporting, if you have a material cybersecurity incident that's impacting the shareholders and value of the organization, that gets reported on a current form called the 8K. And you also were required for periodic disclosures regarding, this is kind of interesting to me, certainly, but also I think any organization that's kind of publicly traded is think about your cybersecurity policies and procedures, specifically how you're managing and calibrating information security risk within the business. How are those policies and practices being implemented, and by whom? And how do you know that they're being implemented? Now, these are questions that the board could be asking, with certainty. What assurance are we getting? And it also goes on to say that now in these publicly traded companies, what level of cybersecurity expertise does the board have, if any? And given that expertise, right, which the SEC is advocating for, how are they taking that expertise to better manage cybersecurity risk? So the times are definitely changing. Thinking about the composition of your own board from a capabilities perspective. Do we have cybersecurity expertise? If you're not sure, or well, sorry, somebody took a CISSP exam a few years ago, got a certification. That's a good start, but really start to think about, hey, how do we ramp up in that area and get a little bit more advanced than perhaps where we're at today? Because there's more. So more regulation, just what we all gleefully want to hear about here on Wednesday, but this is also just very recent. So the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act of 2022. So this just became law literally last month, and it's really compressing that time frame for organizations if they suffer an incident. And incidentally, when I say organizations, if you're an organization operating within one of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors. Now, I'll spare you from going through all 16, but generically it's information technology, financial services, critical manufacturing, energy comes to mind, healthcare, and so forth. And most of you listening are probably operating within one of the 16. And if you are, and there's an incident, depending on the type of incident, if you're a covered entity, you have to disclose to Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency very kind of context-based information regarding that incident. And before I get into what those specifics are, this law also grants additional powers to CISA that they didn't have before. So for example, the power to subpoena, refer non-compliant organizations who aren't reporting into CISA to the DOJ for potential litigation. So certainly want to avoid that naturally, but this has not been finalized. It's not gone to the Federal Register just yet. It's my understanding it's about 40 months out yet, 3.5 years or so. So I would invite you just to think about, regardless of how a covered entity ultimately is defined, if you look at these 6 data points, and there's more in the law, but if we had an incident today in our organization, wouldn't we be able to identify the information systems, the networks, the devices that were impacted, or at least reasonably have good measure to understand what was impacted? What about what vulnerabilities that were exploited? What software or configuration-based weaknesses? What protective and detective countermeasures and corrective actions that we have in place that failed, that we thought were going to defend the business? What about this 4th one, the tactics and techniques that the adversary used to compromise the organization to begin with? So just to kind of think about this in maybe a little bit more clear terms, it's easy to ask for this information, but if you've ever been involved with an incident, it can be very chaotic. Oftentimes you're learning situational awareness in real time. So you're learning new things about the incident. Now, as we're learning that, can we respond to CISA in 72 hours? Well, if it's a ransom-based event and ransomware payments are involved, within 24 hours. So I understand the desire to have notification processes in place, but this is ripe for a tabletop exercise in your organization. Don't wait till 40 months from now and you have a bad thing happen, and now you're beholden to this law. To maybe do a little bit of exercising of these, even through a chain email to the audience that needs to know in your organization. If we had an incident, would we be able to extract these data points within a reasonable time frame? What's the time frame? 72 to 24 hours, depending. That's a lot of demand to place on your security operations teams, in my opinion. And so what often happens is you kind of parachute in, the SEAL team forensics group, and they come in and do all the analysis for you. But even so, we can let the attorneys kind of figure that much out. But how would you arrive at these types of conclusions in your own business? So shareholder derivative lawsuits, tying this back to kind of board accountability. First of all, what is a derivative lawsuit? So these are when negligent actions or poor judgment, or there's been some breach that's perceived by shareholders, a breach of fiduciary duty by corporate directors and the CXO suite, if you will, resulting in these shareholders taking action against the organization that they have stock in, for example. So they file in the name of the corporation when management refuses to act because one or more of the defendants is maybe a board member or a CEO, for example, right? So the derivative action is actually the corporation suing its own management team for some degree of malfeasance. And why would you want to do that? Well, the goal is to kind of, you're trying to buoy the organization and limit damage that can be further incurred to shareholders, so that if we won, right? Those profits from any lawsuit that are won go back into the business, maybe to buoy stock price or kind of get invested into better controls, maybe new leadership teams and board members. But historically, because some of these nuances, and of course, a blanket disclaimer, I'm not an attorney, but when they were brought up, the derivative lawsuits, they weren't very successful because some of these challenges and good litigation, by the defense, let's just say. So, but that's changing, and I think the more that we get this expectation of cybersecurity oversight, the more challenging these types of derivative lawsuits may be to defend against. And so just here's an example of what one of those case studies might look like. So this is Yahoo, January 2019. Federal District Court in California approved a $29 million settlement for a shareholder derivative lawsuit against former directors regarding data breaches that occurred over a series of time, 2013 and 2016. Now, the shareholders were essentially maintaining that there was negligence by the directors because they not only failed to disclose the breaches of customer names, email addresses, and, oh, by the way, date of birth, encrypted passwords, telephone numbers, no laughing matter, 500 million users. So they somehow forgot to disclose that in a timely manner. But it turns out that reasonable and appropriate cybersecurity measures were also apparently not implemented, and that they engaged in the cover-up. So that's kind of good news for people who like bad news if you're Yahoo in that sense. Interestingly, Verizon was in the process of purchasing Yahoo, and so they were going through the discovery process as part of that M&A, that acquisition. And as a result of this, right, so this lack of oversight and this very kind of scrupulous fiduciary duties neglect, they were able to negotiate a $350 million reduction of the purchase price. So you add that to the 29 million in the settlement, and you're creating towards $400 million. So it could have been avoided, in a better state with perhaps better board oversight and cyber accountability. Some of the challenges that we have here, though, is that these discussions in some organizations, when they occur at the board, they get very technical, and that's fine if you have a very technical board and they kind of understand where it is that the CISO or the security leader is going with that discussion point. But as we talked about, many boards aren't technically literate, especially when it comes to cyber. So if you're driven by technology-related vulnerabilities as opposed to business risks, this can create a real struggle for the organization. And so PwC kind of had this interesting data point in one of their corporate surveys, and they said, how well do your directors understand the company's cybersecurity vulnerabilities? And about a third of them said, yeah, we understand it, we get it, cybersecurity vulns. I'd be curious if you dig down, how many of those were tech companies out of the third that said, yes, they understand, because in reality, at least according to this data set, 2/3 said we sort of understand it, and some of us said, no, we really don't understand that. So point being is, at that board level, we're trying to find that right balance. We don't want to go overly technical. We want to find that marriage point between conveying technical risk in clear and understandable business terms. So that's really the goal. And one of the things that we're trying to do with our course here at Tepper is simplify this process for directors. The good news is the vast majority of these compromises are based on known problems that have known solutions. I mean, poor patch management, poor asset management, poor configuration management. We've known about those as an industry within information technology for many, many decades, and yet these problems still haunt organizations even here in 2022. So cyber risks manifest themselves through these cyber attacks, which cause these business risks to materialize. Business risks meaning we can't produce widgets. We're facing some type of financial impact in civil or some type of litigation because of a regulatory governed data set got breached. So as part of our fiduciary duty, we can use this understanding that we have as a board member, take our business understanding and align that with how can we better defend our assets in line with a cybersecurity strategy. So point being is that we're focusing our discussions on cyber risk, thinking about the kind of the tactical and operational and strategic operations and the bottom line, and not computer-based vulnerabilities, right? So I have an example here, shortcoming, to try and tie these concepts in brief together. So Documenting this relationship regarding the risk the business faces, understanding what cyber attacks could disrupt our operations. Well, Greg, where do we get this information from? That might come through a threat intelligence service, maybe an information sharing and analysis center. If you're in financial services, for example, the FSISAC can help with situational awareness about maybe cyber adversaries that are targeting organizations, in the vertical within which you operate. And there are information sharing and analysis centers for almost every vertical: healthcare, education, et cetera. So protect these critical business activities. So for example, it's not just our health records database. Yes, that's where the patient data goes in this example, but also that helps facilitate billing and how we bill for services, insurance companies, and so forth. So what underlying business processes might be accessing that information? And so we can start to get this understanding is if we go through a kind of a very basic threat model. So this is something that I like, this surveillance self-defense that was originally developed by our friends at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. But if you think about this operationally within your business, whether you're a board member, cyber defender, somebody with a curiosity and you're listening to this presentation and you're working for an organization, what is it that you need to protect? Intellectual property, healthcare information, manufacturing data, top secret government data on a missile guidance system. I wouldn't know, you do. What is that information? What do we need to protect it from? Who are those adversaries, both kind of maybe within our supply chain, external and internal to the business? How likely is it that we'll need to protect it? Well, if you're listening to this presentation, chances are you've come to the conclusion that, yeah, maybe we need to do a better job. Is there something I can do to kind of enhance that board level awareness? What happens if we fail, right? Not just maybe financial damage. There are organizations literally that have suffered ransomware attacks. There's a company called CodeSpaces, for example, where they get hit with a ransomware attack. Their backups got encrypted. They were extorted. They couldn't pay the ransomware fee, and they went out of business. So that could be the consequence. Naturally, we don't want to get there, but so how much trouble are we willing to go through to prevent the bad thing from happening? And again, this comes to cyber literacy and making judicious, risk-based investment decisions. So one way we can do that is developing a cybersecurity threat narrative. So, I talked about, do we understand how the business makes money? Do we understand what assets are helping us kind of maintain fulfillment of making a profit for the business, for example? So what business activities generate revenue? What technologies support that? What risks do we face, right? And again, this might take you, a few weeks or some time to aggregate this, or maybe some of you, already have access to this intelligence and you need to think about, well, how do I organize that in a simplistic manner that I can convey to our stakeholders? How could a cyber attack impact our business? Is the C-suite engaged? Are they listening? If you go into a board meeting, and I've seen these presentations, and you're the CISO and you have 55 slides to present in 20 minutes, I mean, you're doomed to fail, right? I mean, we want to focus on what are the greatest risks to the business? What's the likelihood of those risks materializing in our business? What's the cost if that bad thing happens, and what's the cost to prevent it or correct it? And then we can start to maybe focus on those reasonable investment decisions. So are our cybersecurity defenses operating as intended? So if we just walk through an example here, so here we have a cloud-based electronic health records system, and we've simplified this here for our presentation today, but we have Community Hospital ABC. So they've decided, they've made an investment to use this cloud-based system. It's no longer going to be on-premise, it's going to be in the cloud, hosted in Microsoft Azure, and this is where we record and orchestrate all of our patient billing and data points about what ailment the patient is suffering from, and how we're going to treat that ailment, and how are we going to bill for it in this instance. So we need two things. We need the clinician and we need the patient. And then we do the orchestration through the EHR system about what conversations take place there. Supporting these business technologies, right? If we get disrupted in any one of these areas, so confidentiality, who has access to that EHR system, integrity, who can and cannot modify that data, and the fidelity of that record and that transaction, and available. Do the people that need access to it, like the clinician, have access to that system when they need? I would add a fourth one there for some of you. In this case, it could be patient safety, a life critical system. Could be employee safety. Some of these organizations I work with that are automating huge, massive vehicles are looking to do that down the road for mining operations, for instance. If you have a multi-ton vehicle careening off a path because of a disrupted technology workflow, you could put life in jeopardy. So the point is that losing or disrupting any of these could jeopardize the business. So we kind of catalog this critical business activity. Here's the EHR system. What are the risks? We talked about unauthorized access, and the system is unavailable. What are the supporting technologies, right? So we know that we've enabled this in the Azure cloud. Endpoint workstations and mobile devices are accessing this EHR system. I'll just pause here for a second. Pause in the sense that if any of you, and it's probably most of you listening, you're deploying data into the cloud, whether it's AWS or the Google Cloud Platform or Azure, ... we can keep going. Think about, as you would if that asset were on premise, at least you should be, what's the configuration of that cloud tenant look like? I can tell you firsthand, my organization, we did about half a dozen secure configuration audits of cloud tenants last year. And so we were invited in to do the assessment. So the organization said, hey, we're not feeling real good. We just want to validate. And in every single one of those, not one of those organizations had comported or conformed their cloud tenant to better practice. There's not ambiguity here. We know what better practice in securing these things should look like, at least as a starting point, but oftentimes we're not doing that. So think about those types of important details. If we fail to do that, what are the consequences? Well, we could exploit a non-hardened cloud tenant. Maybe they have poor authentication, poor API configuration, et cetera. So we get inappropriate access and breach of patient data. Who might want to do this? I don't know. In this case, it's just maybe some nation state actor or some curious external adversary or a malicious insider. So we kind of paint this picture. Okay, here's what the system does. Here's the technologies that rely on. By the way, this helps us survive as an entity. It gives us a differentiator. And this cataloging this can help us prioritize, ideally, risk mitigation. So you can think if we're having a 15-minute conversation and we have to present on cyber risk to the board, right? So we use this threat narrative to have a more focused conversation. And you don't have to read these all out loud, but you could envision maybe for a quarter or half a year, you have 10 of these risks identified, right? Now, financially, perhaps you can't mitigate all 10, but you say, well, here's the 10 that we've identified. So you're setting the stage. If there's risk within the business, here's maybe the top 3 or the top 5 that we're looking or we're recommending the business mitigate. And you're impartial to this as much as you can be. It's not an emotional discussion. Now it's very pragmatic and financially driven. So how do we make money? This is successfully treating and billing patients. What technologies are used for this? In this case, it's cloud-based EHR system. Who might want to exploit that? We talked about that on the prior chart. What's the likelihood of occurrence? You're like, oh, Greg, I see it now. This is where everything falls apart, right? Likelihood of occurrence. This would come from hopefully from your risk management team, probability and likelihood and so forth. If you're like, oh, geez, I'm not sure. I don't know if I have a quantitative data point. Okay, let's for now remove that from our mindset, right? Here we're looking for general indicator. If you're in an industry that's being targeted, like healthcare, like financial services, et cetera, we're saying the likelihood of this occurring, especially if we know this system has not been hardened, is fairly high. Now, what happens if the bad thing occurs? Average breach costs. I talked about this being kind of reporting season. Again, precision doesn't matter here in the sense that we're trying to convey the realities of the situation. We know we're going to have to pay, right? Maybe through a regulatory fine, class action lawsuits. On average, maybe that's $9.2 million. Now, it turns out the cost to mitigate this, we want to make that risk-based decision. We're going to have to buy some automated configuration management software. Maybe we have to upgrade our vulnerability management platform, et cetera. It turns out that's going to cost a little over north of $1 million. Now, there's no advanced math involved here, right? We can say, well, if this risk materializes, it's going to cost 9.2 to the business. If I make this decision at 1.1, that seems like the wise thing to do. 1.1 less than 9.2. I'm going to go that direction, right? At least inform the board that this seems like the reasonable thing to do. Now, ultimately, the business can make that decision. But I really look at that as the cost of risk reduction, right? If we want to reduce and better manage this risk, here's the investment we need to make as an organization. So it starts to move away from these overly overly technical conversations about configuration management and so forth, and it starts to really impart this decision to your bottom line, right? I mean, how are we best defending the business at the end of the day? So you take that, maybe that cybersecurity threat narrative, just for, you know, if you're not familiar, or maybe you're standing up a cybersecurity operation program for the first time, there's a lot of excellent control frameworks out there that get into kind of the administrative, physical, and technical safeguards, generally from a policy and procedural and a risk management perspective. So whether it's if you're in the defense industrial base and the cybersecurity maturity model certification, CMMC, which is coming online and certainly will be prevalent over the years ahead. The International Organization for Standardization, ISO 27001, PCI DSS, which incidentally, you know, they just came out with a revised DSS standard last month, and so forth. So we can look at those control frameworks to kind of get guidance on how we might want to architect a better practice cybersecurity program. Now, when it comes to technically defending the business, you know, those frameworks that I just mentioned don't really get prescriptive and don't go into technical defenses. Now, the good news there is that you can marry one of those governance frameworks, right, and underpin that with good technical defense. What might that look like? Well, we like to think the Center for Internet Security, the CIS controls, are a wonderful place to start. And again, what we're doing here is removing ambiguity. You know, if you get 10 security engineers in a room and talk about defending the business, they're each going to have their own opinion about what's most important. And here's what I think is interesting. And, you know, I think we need to do a better job of static code analysis or something along those lines. But in reality, because we know that these organizations are suffering from very common problems, we can think about cyber hygiene. So if we're a startup-based organization or a nonprofit, we have now in version 8 and as of version 7.1, these implementation groups, right? So what's our aspiring goal? You know, this isn't meant to be a dissertation on any of these control portfolios, but it is to say that if we're starting technically defending the business, what we might want to focus on is basic cyber hygiene. Now, I'm accomplishing two things there, right? I can use this standard, which is free to download. I can look at what those technical controls are. And as we start to gain traction and get maturity, let's say we get the 56 cyber safeguards for defense implemented, we've achieved basic cyber hygiene. You know, that's something tangible that we could convey to the board, that maybe our marketing team wants to use, believe it or not, and talk about this, put that in their vernacular. Now, where do we go from there? After, it doesn't mean, okay, hey, we have implementation group 1 achieved, we have basic cyber hygiene, and we high five and we leave. You know, it's a constant evolution, because the adversary, they're not staying static, right? They're constantly evolving their trade craft, and we need to hold our teams to account as well. So there's kind of an evolutionary property to the CIS controls, which I really like and I think is nice. And if you're beyond a startup and you're not a nonprofit, you know, that the implementation groups are meant to help you calibrate, okay, where do we fall? If we're a large bank or a large healthcare organization, you know, we're already in the IG3 category. But the point is, we can start to kind of think about how do we measure up against these types of technical defenses. Okay, the controlled organization, there's 18 different families of controls. They are prioritized, so start at 1. You work your way through the control families. Now, it doesn't mean that it has to be in a linear fashion. We start at 1, and then 7 years from now, we get to CIS control 18. You know, you can divide and delegate this to your various teams. So, you know, for example, perhaps CIS controls 1 through 7 go to maybe your desktop support, server infrastructure. You know, 8 through 13 could go to your network engineers and network operations, and let's just say 14 through 18 go to maybe your DevOps, DevSecOps teams, your incident handlers, and so on. Okay, so just a way to maybe compartmentalize that and divide and conquer. Beyond kind of those administrative frameworks and technical control frameworks, if we were looking for guidance just for boards, generally speaking, you know, as of 2014, it was somewhat limited, but that's changing for the better, thankfully. So the National Association of Corporate Directors, you know, they've developed these their risk oversight handbook, which they've made available for some time now. There's kind of these 5 key principles that get into making sure that the business acknowledges, you know, enterprise risk should be thought of in that sense, and not just isolated to IT alone, all the way down to thinking about how are we managing cyber risk, including cyber liability insurance, if we think it's applicable. So I was delighted to be a part of a team when we were working with the SEI CERT to help the NACD kind of develop their first practices around cyber risk oversight, and they kind of continue to iterate and improve upon that. But there's more kind of as we wind down here. I mean, we're delighted here at the Tepper School of Business to be offering our own class, kind of very modular, meant to be direct and full of kind of anecdotal lessons learned. So cybersecurity accountability in the corporate board. This is an executive education course. You can scan the QR code or go onto our website, look at the curriculum in more detail. I know we're coming up on an hour here, so I won't go into every kind of nuanced detail. But really the goal here is to take, for example, some of you listening, if not everybody that's listening, and we thank you for joining. If you have an interest in enhancing your acumen at that board level, improving cyber literacy at the board level, that's really what we're going to dive into, but making it impactful so that these individuals can be kind of become that translator of understanding, okay, what are the cyber risks to the business and how do I translate that back to real world impact and decisions that we can then make in an informed manner. So when it comes to vulnerability management, we'll have some discussions around that for sure. Measuring performance over time. What are the expectations of a cyber literate board and so forth? So invite you to please check out that course and register if you have any questions. We'd love to hear from you as well here, not here in the chat, via email as well. And so kind of in closing, really the goal of my mission as an instructor, as a practitioner, and the goal that we have here at Tepper with our new course is to improve board level cyber hygiene, right? We want to add cybersecurity expertise, make sure it's kind of embedded into the board. If this can't be done, then maybe you have to bring in external experts for relevant briefings, but now at least, hey, maybe we have a path forward or some things to consider that we weren't doing prior. Establish a cybersecurity committee staffed by cyber-informed directors, ideally. I mean, one or two to start with. And this might be embedded perhaps within a risk management or an audit committee to start, but I would like ideally to see it as its own kind of dedicated committee and ensure clarity about what information both the board and wider stakeholders require. We talked about that cyber threat narrative, but you can iterate and naturally refine that specific to your business. So and kind of establish these accountability measures and mature over time. Just as I talked about examining your information security program and its maturity, we can also measure the maturity of our board over time as well. So that's kind of a measurement that maybe initially we're not taking, but as we do, and how are we kind of acknowledging and gaining the benefits from improving cyber literacy at the board level? Let's measure that over time as well, so to hold the board and the leadership team to account. All right, well, I'm happy to answer any questions, Susan, that you may have logged.
Absolutely. Well, let's give our participants a second to please enter any questions for Greg in the chat. Greg, thank you for such a salient and useful overview of the topic. That was really fantastic. I think while we wait to see if questions come in, I may share screen and just go over a couple more key details of the program. So right now I'm sharing the program overview schedule. As Greg mentioned, we meet just about every other week starting on April 27th. The program is fully online, synchronous, so you'll have a chance to interact directly with Greg, ask questions, and also meet your fellow cohort members who may be facing similar problems in industry. The sessions are 2 hours long, and we'll create an online course site where we can host recordings in case you are unable to make a session or two. In addition, one of the most common questions we get is who should attend the program. Obviously, from the title, we're aiming this at the corporate board level, but we think the program is ultimately very useful for different people throughout the organization. Greg, I don't know if you'd like to chime in on this list of who may find the program useful and why.
Yeah, sure. So it's everyone. No, I'm just kidding. But I mean, it's really, and I kind of touched on this briefly in today's presentation, but if you're a startup, for example, and you have big visions of where the company can go, we would invite you to take this course to kind of understand as we grow, what do some of those obligations look like? Maybe you're already in a leadership position within an organization. You think, hey, down the road, I might want to be a board member, or how can I maybe advise my board members in a more informed fashion? Certainly, I think those individuals can benefit from the course as well, Susan. And then naturally, I would say, the kind of the sweet spot is really looking for those board members. I know they're out there who are being challenged when it comes to cybersecurity to kind of improve their understanding of cybersecurity operations, how they can challenge their executive suite in an informed manner. I mean, these are intelligent people, so let's give them the right kind of questions to ask and things to monitor over time to hold the team to account and ultimately improve the operations of the company. So, it's my opinion, of course, I guess somewhat selfishly, that I do think cybersecurity is going to continue to be a differentiator. Simplistically, even if we take it at a binary, if you're breached and your competitor is not, where is the maybe your constituency going to look to do business? Well, we're looking for the organization that isn't as disrupted as often, whose platform is available when we need it, who writes secure software that we don't have to constantly get updates for, and then they're finding bugs all the time. And so we're not, look, I know those things happen, but this is a way that we can kind of use the intelligence we're gathering from these types of programs to improve those processes.
Absolutely. And I know Greg was kind enough to share his contact information, but love to share mine as well. If you have any questions about the program, about executive education, please don't hesitate to reach out. I've also placed a link in the chat to register for the program via the Tepper Exec Ed website. Greg, finally, I don't see any questions in the chat, but lots of thanks for the presentation.
Oh, sure, my pleasure. Yep, and if you have a question down the road, feel free to reach out via email.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to everyone for attending, and we hope to see you in the program on April 27th. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.